This week has been in celebration of the new MA in spirituality, ecology and mental health. And in many ways, this week has been a taster for the diverse range of topics and practices and traditions that are at the heart of spirituality around the world. I suppose, in a sense, then, spirituality is a choice to grow and develop beyond our limited and smaller self. And in many ways, that perhaps mirrors the choice that we make when we sign up to do courses such as this MA and others. I suppose what I'm saying is spirituality goes hand in hand with learning. It takes us, it's a choice to take us beyond what is known, to change our lives, to transform. And we believe that this course is transformative, both personally and socially. There's a really strong emphasis built into this on employing our best self in service of something bigger, something more meaningful. And I suppose I'm sharing this because, in a sense, this course is my contribution to that end. So to summarize the week, it has been a brilliant week. I hope you've really enjoyed it. We've had some wonderful speakers, and I know we're going to have a great session tonight. This week then has perhaps been about meaningful connections, connections with ourselves, connections with nature, connections with the sacred and with each other, and how those connections can be transformative of ourselves, our communities, and the worldview that we're seeing and experience reality through. And that brings me to Dr. Steve Taylor. In many ways, today is the birthday of his new book, Disconnection. This isn't the official launch, but it's wonderful to have him here today on the day that the book is being published in the UK. And we're honoured to share this special occasion with you, Steve. I've admired your work for many years, and so it's a pleasure to be able to meet you, even if it's virtually, at last. Steve is a senior lecturer at Leeds Beckett University. He's a prolific author of books that I absolutely adore and love: The Fall, The Leap, Extraordinary Awakenings, but there are many, many more titles as well. He's the former chair of the transpersonal division of the British Psychological Society, and is a frequent contributor to Psychology Today and the Scientific American. And I know, I think it's right in saying that you've been on radio this week. Is it in the mornings doing
prayer for the day? Yeah, very early this morning. Oh, all this week. Yeah, it's 5:45. I was giving my prayer for the day.
So he's a regular contributor to radio and published over 100 articles. Welcome, Steve, and I'm going to pass everything over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to participate in this week of presentations commemorating your new master's degree. So nice to meet everybody. And I'm going to speak, as Lee told us, I'm going to speak about my new book, Disconnection. And, you know, it is a very special day, as Lee said, the birthday of my book. Although I was saying to Lee, it's always a bit anticlimactic, you know, the birthday of a book is a bit like a real birthday. Nothing really happens, you know, but it is a kind of psychological celebration, if not a real celebration of a new book's entry into the world. And it's a letting go as well. You know, I was thinking when a new book's published, it's a bit like letting a child leave home and go to university to make its way in the world. So you've got to support from the sidelines and give it all the goodwill you can. So you're in control of my slides, Lee, aren't you? That's right. I believe. Great. So I'm going to speak about connection and disconnection. I think that connection is, in many ways, or the degree of connection that we possess is in many ways the essential human trait which determines our behavior, which determines our character, the nature of our personality. And on a wider level, it also determines the nature of societies as well. disconnection or connection is a kind of individual trait, but it's also collectively, it becomes a social trait as well. Societies can be classed in terms of their degree of connection or disconnection too. So I'm going to speak about, initially I'm going to speak about disconnection, about people who are extremely disconnected. I call them hyper disconnected people. And a bit later on, I'm going to speak about the opposite. I'm going to speak about people who are strongly connected or hyper connected people, as I call them. Then I'll speak a little bit about hyper disconnected societies and also connected societies. And we'll also speak about spirituality, because to me, spirituality is connection, or connection is the essence of spirituality. I sometimes talk about what I call awakening experiences or spiritual experiences, but they could also be seen as connection experiences. Spiritual experiences are essentially experiences of connection with the world around us, with nature, with the natural world, connection with other people or other beings, or connection with the whole cosmos, and also connection with our own deeper essential being. So connection, it covers a lot of different aspects. And I see spiritual paths as essentially paths of connection, whether it's Buddhism or the Kabbalah or the path of Sufism, or even meditation itself. The essence of meditation is connection to your own deeper being and connection to the world around you. So I'll speak about the kind of spiritual aspects of this a bit later on. I'm going to begin by showing you a letter, which is on the next slide, if you can, Lee. I'm not sure how legible this is for you, but this is a letter which was written in 1939 by Mahatma Gandhi to Adolf Hitler. Gandhi was in India at the time, and he heard warnings of a new world war, which seemed to be escalating or becoming imminent in Europe. So he decided to write a letter to Hitler, and it wasn't as crazy as it or as far-fetched as it might seem, because Gandhi had actually met Mussolini a few years earlier while he was in Europe, and Mussolini he kind of raved about Gandhi. He was very impressed with Gandhi because of his opposition to the British Empire. So I think Gandhi probably suspected that, or probably hoped that Mussolini had told Hitler about Gandhi, and Hitler was aware of his activities and had a similar kind of positive attitude towards him as Mussolini. So Gandhi decided to write to Hitler to try to stop the imminent Second World War. And he said, addressing Hitler as dear friend, he said, "Friends have been urging me to write to you for the sake of humanity. And a bit later on, it is quite clear that you are today the one person in the world who can prevent a war which may reduce humanity to a savage state. Must you pay that price for an object, however worthy it may appear to you to be? We listen to the appeal of one who has deliberately shunned the method of war, not without considerable success," and so forth. Nobody knows if this letter actually reached Hitler, and nobody really knows if he actually left India. But once the war began, a few months later, just a couple of months later, a few months into the war, Gandhi wrote to Hitler again, impelling him to stop the destruction and the madness of the war in a more kind of passionate way. I think in this letter, he's being more rational and dispassionate. But anyway, obviously, these letters had no effect. We can just imagine Hitler just throwing them into the fire in a rage. But I think one reason why these letters are significant is because they illustrate two different sides of human nature, two different types of human being, if you like. I mean, Gandhi was certainly not a perfect person, but he kind of illustrated a spiritual aspect of humanity. He illustrated a kind of a sense of, or a principle of universal compassion and self-sacrifice. He kind of illustrated a willingness to sacrifice his own well-being for universal moral principles or for the well-being of others, which is what he did in his. He undertook several fasts in which he came close to death in order to promote peace or stop conflict. And Hitler was obviously an incredibly disordered and psychopathic individual who had no capacity for empathy or emotion, no conscience, no guilt, and somebody who was willing to allow or cause mass destruction and murder in order to try to achieve his own aims. somebody who was completely indifferent to the sufferings of others. So in that sense, I see Hitler and Gandhi as kind of illustrating the two poles of human nature, the connected aspect of human nature, which is illustrated by Gandhi, and the disconnected aspect, which is illustrated by Hitler. And if we just turn to Hitler for a moment, I classify Hitler as a hyper disconnected person, an extremely disconnected person who lives in a state of complete extreme separation. Somebody who is so disconnected to other human beings and to the world around them that the world is scarcely real and other human beings are scarcely real to them. Other human beings are just objects to hyper disconnected people. The world is a vague and hazy, slightly unreal place to them, which is why they also have a capacity for self-delusion, because the world of their own subjective thoughts and feelings is more real to them than the world itself. So if the world itself doesn't fit to their thoughts and feelings, they mold the world into a perspective which suits their desires. And Gandhi, on the other hand, let's say an extremely connected person such as Gandhi, they have a strong sense of empathy towards other human beings. They have a strong sense of justice and compassion, and they are willing to undergo discomfort or even suffering in order to alleviate other people's suffering or to support other people's development. And connected people, they have a different kind of self. Their self is more fluid, whereas disconnected people have a very rigid, egoic sense of identity. They're walled in, enclosed within their own mental space. Connected people have a more fluid sense of identity, which merges with other people's identity, merges with the world around them, so that they are not separate. They feel a sense of participation, a sense of belonging, and a sense of compassion and fellow feeling towards other beings and other people. Could you switch to the next slide, Lee? Thank you. So I illustrate this with a model which I call the continuum of connection. And in many ways, my whole book is a kind of quite a long explanation of this model. This is kind of the essence of my book. So, you know, it's always struck me as very interesting that human beings cover such a wide spectrum of behavior and character, from psychopathic personalities who are brutal and incredibly selfish, who manipulate and brutalize other human beings, to, you know, saint-like, compassionate human beings who are extremely altruistic. So we kind of cover a massive spectrum from the psychopath to the saint. And this is what I try to illustrate with the continuum of connection. So on the left side, we have people who live in extreme disconnection. And these, in conventional modern day psychology, they may be classed as dark triad personalities. The dark triad is a kind of a recent concept which has kind of superseded the old notion of psychopaths and sociopaths and so forth. I think nowadays there's a recognition that conditions like psychopathy or narcissistic personality are kind of interlinked. They're difficult to separate. So we need a more kind of holistic, integrated concept, which the dark triad concept tries to illustrate. So the three dark triad traits are psychopathic traits, narcissistic traits, and Machiavellian traits. So they usually belong together in people who are, as I would say, extremely disconnected. So these people, as I've suggested already, they lack empathy and conscience. They are brutal, they're selfish, they're indifferent to notions, they have no concept of morality. If they have any morality at all, it's what it emerges from their own desires. So whatever is good is what supports or enables them to satisfy their desires. What is bad is whatever obstructs their desires. That's a very simple, basic sense of morality. But I prefer the term hyper-disconnection because I think the essential trait of what some psychologists would call a dark triad personality, or what other psychologists might call a psychopath or a person with narcissistic personality disorder, it is disconnection. These are people who are completely enclosed or entrapped within themselves, with no sense of connection to other people or to the world itself. And at the other end of the continuum of connection, we have the realm of spirituality, and this is also the realm of empathy, compassion, altruism. People who are selfless rather than selfish. People who live by universal moral principles rather than a personal selfish morality or no morality at all. And yeah, I think this is the realm of mystics. It's the realm of what we call enlightenment. Enlightenment is the polar opposite of psychopathy, you know, if you want to put it that way. Enlightenment is a state of union, a state of extreme connection to all of the beings, towards the whole cosmos itself, to all that is real. We feel interlinked and interconnected with everything to the extent that we have no separate identity. So yeah, here we're in the realm of mysticism, awakening experiences. That's when we experience this state temporarily. And as I say, you know, this is the polar opposite of psychopathy and narcissistic personality disorder. And I guess most human beings are somewhere in the middle. You know, there aren't too many people with psychopathic traits, fortunately, but neither are there many people who exist in a state of enlightenment or wakefulness. Some psychologists suggest that about 0.5 or 1% of people have psychopathic traits. And maybe it's something similar for enlightenment or wakefulness. Maybe 0.5 or 1% of people have traits of wakefulness or enlightenment. So I think, you know, there is an error here: personal, moral, spiritual development. I think the task of our lives, you know, or what development essentially means, is to move further along the continuum of connection, to move from disconnection to a more connected state. That is what essentially any form of development means, whether it's classed as personal or moral or spiritual. And as we'll see later, that applies on a social level too. You know, social progress also means moving further along the continuum of connection. Could you bring me my next slide, Lee, please? So these are some of the characteristics of hyper-disconnected people. So the first few chapters of my book are basically an analysis of hyper-disconnected people and how they cause havoc and destruction in the world. And as I said before, their main trait is extreme disconnection, a lack of empathy and conscience, disregard for the well-being of others. It's also important that they're free from guilt and inhibition and embarrassment. That's why hyper-disconnected people are often quite charismatic. They often appear appealing and attractive to other people, because they project a seeming confidence and decisiveness, precisely because they seem to lack inhibition and guilt and embarrassment. They seem to have no fear. They have this incredible seeming confidence. And also they're often charming. They project charm as a way of manipulating people. They often have a glib, sort of shallow view of the world, which may seem appealing to some people. And so that is why they often have success in society, you know, particularly in the area of politics, as we'll see in a moment. And as I said before, they have a tendency to self-delusion as well, precisely because of their disconnection from reality. And another of their main traits is a continual sense of dissatisfaction. They are never happy. You know, happiness is elusive, very elusive to them. They exist in a continual state of frustration. And that is precisely because they are so separate. Because they're so separate, there's a strong feeling of lack, a strong feeling of being cut off from the world, of being a fragment, you know, that somehow feels its isolation, even if only at an unconscious level. You know, if you think about it, most of the well-being that we experience in life comes from connection to other people, connection to nature, connection to our own deeper being, you know, moments of quietness or meditation. So these people, because they're so disconnected, they are cut off from all of these sources of happiness. They can't form true, deep, authentic relationships with other people. And they can't gain any satisfaction from being in the world because they're so disconnected from the world. And that translates into, as I said before, a sense of lack, which in turn leads to an obsessive desire to accumulate. You know, if something is lacking, you project that outside and you try to gather things, you try to add things to yourself. to compensate for your sense of lack. And that's why these people are often obsessed with power, wealth, fame. They're always wanting more attention, more wealth, more power, more admiration to compensate for their strong sense of lack. And that leads to the next question, actually. Can you just skip 2 slides ahead, please, Lee? This is where I want you to ponder for a moment. Imagine if you are a careers advisor, a young person comes to you for advice. You give them a personality test, and it's clear that they are hyper disconnected or have dark triad traits. So they are the kind of person I've just described, hyper disconnected person. What career would you recommend for this person? We're being a bit ironic and slightly humorous here, but what career would you recommend for this person? I don't know if there's a chat box you could write in, but if there is a chat box, or just ponder for a few moments. Obviously, it wouldn't be a hyper disconnected person wouldn't be a teacher or a nurse. Hopefully there wouldn't be. A caring profession would not be suitable for them because of their lack of empathy. And they because of their urge for power and domination and admiration, they'd be attracted to a high status role of some form, a sort of hierarchical position at the top levels of the hierarchy. Well, I think there are generally 3, maybe 4 areas which attract hyper disconnected people. One of them, obviously, it depends to an extent on what their socio-economic background is. On a kind of basic, simple level, particularly for people at lower levels of the social hierarchy, they're attracted to criminality. Obviously, criminality has many causes, but criminality of one form or another is very suited for hyper disconnected people because of their lack of conscience and guilt and empathy, and also their urge to accumulate wealth and power. Not petty crime, probably serious crime. I think most serious criminals, long-term criminals. I mean, there are studies which show that a significant number of criminals have low levels of empathy, and that's not always because they are intrinsically hyper disconnected. There may be social factors too, or there may be an element of conditioning involved. But there's certainly a connection between a lack of empathy and criminality. But if somebody with this type of character is from a more privileged economic background, socioeconomic background, they're likely to be attracted to the corporate life, towards business. And there are many studies which show that people with psychopathic traits are highly represented at the highest echelons of the corporate world as HEOs or CEOs and so forth. And that makes sense because these people are attracted to domination, to wealth. So, in a hierarchical society, they're attracted to the business/corporate world. And they're also very attracted to the realm of politics. And this leads to, can you go to the next slide, Lee? Oh yeah, sorry, this explains what I just said in a bit more detail. So if you have a strong desire for power and prestige, together with an absence of empathy, it can lead to criminality, violence and exploitation, or it can lead to political power. It can lead to dictatorship and fascism. And that leads to the phenomenon of pathocracy, which is in the next slide. So this is a Polish psychologist called Andrew Lobachevsky, and he grew up under the Nazi occupation of Poland when he was a young man, and later on he suffered under the Soviet rule of Poland, under the communist Polish regime. And as a psychologist, he felt impelled to study the relationship between power and psychological disorder. So he developed this term pathocracy, which I think is a very important term which deserves to be more widely known. And that's defined as a system of government where a small pathological minority takes control over a society of normal people. And this is basically what happened under Hitler in Nazi Germany. It's what happened under Stalin, and by extension under in the Soviet communist countries throughout Eastern Europe. And if an individual is in a position of if an individual in a position of power is a psychopath, he or she can create an epidemic of psychopathology in people who are not essentially psychopathic. So this is how Lobachevsky explains, the effect of Nazism on Germany. So the mass of people are never psychopathic. Psychopathy is always a minority trait. But once Hitler became established as a leading figure, he attracted other people with psychopathic traits, other hyper-disconnected people, until the whole government in Germany consisted of hyper-disconnected people, the same under Stalin in Russia. So once a government consists of these people, they can use propaganda to create an epidemic of psychopathology in the whole population, this is how he explains, the behavior of the mass of German people under the Nazis. And, if you think about it, pathocracy, it's one of the lesser known forms of government. But if you think about it, it's probably one of the most common forms of government in human history. There are so many well-known dictators who were essentially psychopaths or hyper-disconnected people. There are so many countries throughout the world, particularly in the 20th century, who were ruled by psychologically disordered people with a complete lack of empathy and conscience. And unfortunately, it's still the case now. Positions of power, even here in the UK, even in the US, positions of power unfortunately attract unprincipled, ruthless people who are, who could be classed as dark triad personalities, or, as I would say, hyper-disconnected people. And that isn't to say that all politicians are malevolent and ruthless or psychopathic. Obviously, there are some, altruistic leaders as well. There are some kind of accidental leaders who just gravitate toward positions of power through working up, through a long period of career development. But certainly in the arena of high-level politics, dark triad personalities are very highly represented. And just go to the next slide, please, Lee. Yeah, this is why I call the 20th century the century of pathocracy. Before the 20th century, there are obviously many cases of pathocratic leaders, hyper-disconnected leaders throughout the world. You think of the Roman empires, who were incredibly brutal and sadistic. Think of all the monarchs who were incredibly brutal and sadistic, and so forth. But in some ways, because in sort of pre-20th century, certainly pre-19th century countries, there was a rigid social structure which prevented people from lower classes rising to positions of power, which was in itself that was kind of like a very oppressive form of society in itself. I'm not condoning that society, obviously, but in some ways it actually prevented people with, members of the general population with intensely disconnected traits, to kind of stop them rising into positions of power. But once social structures broke down, anybody was free to rise into positions of power. So a lot of the dictators of the 20th century were from very humble backgrounds. They're all from, almost all of them, from very brutalized backgrounds, violent backgrounds. And so they managed to, by their sheer ruthlessness, by their sheer capacity for violence and manipulation, and also by their kind of charm and charisma, they managed to rise from the lowest levels of society to positions of high power, precisely because they were the most disconnected people. without any forms of democracy, without any constraints, the most disconnected people tend to rise into the positions of highest power. And that's what happened in many countries in the 20th century. A lot of it happened at the end of the colonial era, when many countries were kind of they'd been disrupted by colonial regimes, social structures had broken down, and then once the colonists left, there was a kind of a scramble for power, which was often won by the most psychopathic people, like Idi Amin, for example, whose picture is there in Uganda. All over Africa, there were many instances of hyper disconnected leaders who just rose, took power by their sheer ruthlessness, and then inflicted massive chaos and destruction on their populations. Very similar in South America as well. So 20th century was certainly the century of pathocracy, and there are still many countries in the world which are essentially pathocracies now. Russia being one. Russia is probably the most prevalent example of a pathocracy at the moment. I think the United States under Donald Trump was essentially a pathocracy. One thing that happens in pathocracies is that once a hyper disconnected leader is in power, he tends to attract other people with similar personalities, while principled people, more connected people, tend to fade away. They either resign or they're ejected from government. So quite quickly, you're left with a hardcore of dark tribe personalities in the government. And what they usually do then is they try to undermine democracy. They always hate democracy because it undermines their power. And they don't understand democracy because they see life as a kind of competition where the strongest deserve to win and everyone else should be left behind. So they always try to undermine democracy, just as Donald Trump tried in America. And, I think Boris Johnson, it would be interesting to do a psychological analysis of him, but I'm sure he would be classed as a dark tribe personality, certainly a hyper disconnected personality, who was unable to comprehend notions of morality. And another factor is that hyper disconnected people, they believe, because of their narcissism, they believe that they are competent and skilled and more intelligent than other people. But in actual fact, they're often not particularly competent or intelligent. And that's one of the reasons why, in government, they usually cause a lot of chaos because of their incompetency and also because of their narcissism and their habitual corruption as well. So pathocracy is probably the most, devastating effect of hyper disconnected people once they rise into positions of power. It would be wonderful if we had connected people as leaders, which sometimes occasionally happens, but unfortunately it's not the norm. But now I'd like to move to the other side of the continuum of connection. I want to move into a more positive aspect of human nature. Could you go take me to the next slide? And this is illustrated by altruism. I want you to just ponder for a moment, and I want you to recall a situation when you acted with kindness towards another person, and or a situation when somebody acted with kindness to you, such as when they helped or supported you in some way. So I'll just give you a moment to ponder over those situations. And hopefully you've managed to bring such situations to mind. I'd also like you to ponder over the motivation. What was your motivation for the act of kindness? And if you were the recipient if you thought of a situation where you were the recipient of an act of kindness, what was your motivation? Sorry, what was the person's motivation to be kind to you? Was it some form of hidden selfishness? Were they trying to impress you or get something from you? Were you trying to improve your self-esteem by doing something good so that you could feel good about yourself? Or do you think it was pure altruism? Was it purely altruistic? Did it stem purely from a desire to help another person? Next slide, please, please, Lee. So altruism is quite a controversial subject. From a materialist point of view, it's quite difficult to explain, particularly high-scale altruism, you know, where people endanger their lives or certainly endanger their own safety for the sake of others. Low-level altruism could perhaps be explained in terms of some of these factors, like self-disguised self-interest, reciprocal altruism, kin selection, when we are kind to people who are closely related to us genetically, which helps our own genes indirectly. Yeah, as I say, these theories can explain low-level altruism, but it's more difficult when we think in terms of high-stake altruism. You know, when people actually endanger their own lives for the sake of others, and also when we have animals, that's also quite difficult to explain. And here, the fact that many acts of altruism are impulsive is significant. And we can see this in emergency situations. Many people react to emergency situations with an instinctive altruism, which occurs without any deliberation at all. And here you can ponder over this situation. Imagine that you are standing on a train platform and there's a person next to you who has some kind of medical episode, maybe a stroke or maybe a seizure, and they fall onto the track. And what is your reaction? Do you consider the possibility of whether a train might be coming? Do you think of your own safety? Or would you instinctively jump down onto the track to try to help this person to safety? Well, you might doubt whether you would be willing to jump down onto the track, but you know, in actual fact, there's probably a high likelihood that you would. If you Google this on YouTube, you can find many videos of people jumping down onto train tracks in the subway in New York or train stations in China. Oh, obviously, it's not uncommon for people to fall down onto train tracks from a platform. And it is also by no means uncommon for people to instinctively jump down onto the track to save them, even if they can see a train approaching in the distance. So this sort of illustrates an impulsive altruism which emerges in emergency situations. And there's another example on the next slide. And this comes from, I live in Manchester, and in 2017, you may remember there was a terrorist attack in which 23 people died after a concert by Ariana Grande. And there was a report published recently, just a few months ago, about the response of the emergency services to the attack, which was found to be very wanting. But the report also collected hundreds, if not thousands, of reports of bravery and selflessness by members of the public. And there was a paramedic who was at the scene, commented on the scenes of sort of kindness and altruism which he witnessed. He said, "There was an unbelievable amount of people doing what they could to help. I saw people pulling together, that should be, in a way I'd never seen before. The thing I will remember more than any other is the humanity that was on display." So there were lots of stories of people running back towards the arena to help, even though there was obviously potentially danger there. And you know, there were many reports of people tending to the injured, you know, helping to comfort them and to treat them in a makeshift way until the emergency services arrived. And any terrorist attack, if you read the reports of any terrorist attack, they always feature this impulsive altruism or heroism. It's more heroism actually, because in many terrorist attacks there is a danger sacrificing your own life if you help others. So I think the fact that this kind of heroic altruism is impulsive is very significant because it occurs without deliberation, which suggests that it's instinctive to human beings. And I think this stems from a basic fundamental connection between human beings. This kind of altruism can only really be explained in terms of an ability to sense other people's suffering and to instinctively respond to other people's suffering with altruistic behavior. It stems essentially from an instinctive, impulsive empathy. And empathy is really the only way to explain pure altruism in this sense. You can explain some acts of altruism in terms of egoic altruism, hidden selfishness, costly signaling, reciprocal altruism, but this kind of instinctive, high-scale altruism is basically the result of a connection between us. Could you go to the next slide, please, Lee? So one of the things I suggest in my book is that although many human beings exist in a disconnected state, connection is actually fundamental to human nature. Disconnection is actually an aberration. And usually it's an aberration which arises due to trauma and lack of attachment during early childhood. If you look into the histories of the personal histories of dictators and also serial killers or high-level criminals, they almost always have severely traumatized upbringings with a lack of attachment to parents. So that, to me, that suggests that disconnection is aberrational. There are also social factors too, that disconnected societies tend to produce disconnected individuals. But essentially, human beings exist in a fundamental state of connection. And that's where empathy in its deepest sense stems from. And that's where altruism stems from. The psychologist Daniel Batson developed the empathy altruism hypothesis, suggesting that pure altruism emerges from the human capacity for empathy. So in this sense, empathy is not just the ability to imagine what other people are experiencing, to put yourself in another person's shoes. It's actually the ability on a deeper level to sense other people's feelings, to experience what they are experiencing, to share their being. And that kind of deep empathy illustrates a fundamental connection between human beings, and it also gives rise to altruism. And this takes us into the realm of spirituality. As I said before, the essence of spirituality is connection, and spiritual paths can be considered paths of connection that help us to move further along the continuum of connection. Spiritual experiences could be seen as connection experiences, which enable us temporarily to move along the continuum of connection. Then we may revert back to a more disconnected state. But certainly for a short time, we can shift into a more connected state. And that's why if you look into reports of spiritual experiences, could you move a couple of slides further on, Lee, please? The next one. If you look into reports of spiritual experiences, and there are a few quotes here from reports I've collected, they always express connection to nature, connection to other people. A typical report from one person says, I feel part of nature. I feel a connection with people, but I also feel connected with trees and birds and grass and hills. Another person said, I started seeing every single person as myself, a feeling of connection to everything. And another person spoke about how his feeling of connection brought about a less selfish and a more selfless and more altruistic type of behavior. He said, there is a shift in focus from what I can get from life to what I can give to life. So people who have a spiritual awakening often shift into a more altruistic mode of life because they become much more connected. In my other books, I've often suggested that spiritual awakening is more common than most people realize. And it often happens to people who don't know anything about spirituality in a traditional sense and would not define themselves as spiritual people. It often happens to people in the midst of intense psychological turmoil following a bereavement or a diagnosis of cancer or a long period of addiction. They spontaneously shift into a different identity, which is equivalent to a form of spiritual awakening. And part of that shift involves shifting from an accumulative perspective to a contributory perspective. You know, their lives become about giving rather than getting, as that person suggested. So that's the essence of spirituality, and it's also, you know, the essence of life itself. As I mentioned before, you know, we all feel that we are progressing, or we wish to progress in some way, both individually or socially. We like to feel that we are developing in a more positive direction. And I think that essentially means moving towards connection, moving away from separation towards a more connected state. And as I've highlighted already, that applies to societies too. Just move to I think this is the final slide, Lee. Oh, no, it's not. Actually, could you go to the next slide first? Yeah, that's it. This is what I call the social continuum of connection, which is when the continuum of connection is applied to societies. So on a social level, progress means moving from extremely disconnected societies, which are authoritarian, fascistic, which are essentially pathocracies with a lack of democracy, extremely patriarchal, extremely hierarchical, and so forth, high levels of sexual repression. And also, these societies are often highly religious too. And this obviously applies to many societies in the world today. I'm sure you can think of some societies which conform to that description of extreme disconnection. And on the other hand, on the other side, you have societies which are intensely connected, which tend to be egalitarian, partnership societies, democracy, empathocracy, societies based on empathy and justice and fairness. And, you know, those societies tend to be sexually open, humane forms of punishment. They tend to be peaceful with gender equality and so forth. Interestingly, they tend not to be particularly religious either. They tend to be more secular or have a more kind of general, less defined sense of spirituality. So maybe you can think of some societies in the world which, I mean, I don't think there are many societies in the world which conform to that description of intense disconnection, but there are some societies which kind of move in that direction. You know, certain societies in Western Europe maybe are moving in that direction, or maybe Scandinavia. But I think most societies in the world are somewhere in the middle, probably including the UK or the US. But I think social progress means moving from disconnection to connection in that sense as well. So if you just go revert to the previous slide, Lee, and I'll just finish off. So as I've said, you know, I believe that human beings are essentially connected. I have a philosophical approach which I call panspiritism, which expresses this, that we're all expressions of a fundamental consciousness. We share fundamental consciousness. And because we share the same consciousness, we are capable of empathy. Empathy is the experience of our shared consciousness, which enables us to sense other people's suffering and generates the impulse to alleviate it through altruism. So from that sense, altruism is a natural expression of the fundamental connection between human beings, whereas selfishness and brutality are aberrational. Disconnection itself is aberrational. So although my book is quite bleak in many ways, it deals with many of the most brutal and disordered aspects of human nature. I think there is hope as well. You know, we are moving slowly, very, very slowly, perhaps, towards a more connected state, hopefully individually and socially too. Thank you. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you. Let me stop sharing there. Wow, what a wonderful and extremely powerful and insightful way of bringing so many of the week's themes together. in that talk, Steve, and a book that I most definitely will be buying and looking at, along with many of the others I've already got of yours. So thank you for sharing that. I haven't, while I've been doing my glamorous assistant, my Isla Sinclair impression, I wasn't able to see the screen if there was anything coming up in the background. So I'm going to pass to Matthew for the moment. And if there's any questions that are coming up there, Matthew.
Well, thanks, Lee. Quick answer is that I think people have been listening intensely, so we haven't got much in the chat. So now's an opportunity to raise the question. So whilst people are considering putting something into the chat or the Q&A, or want to raise a hand if they can speak as well, if their microphone's open, can do that. I want to say thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. I'm not sure if you remember when we met a good number of years ago.
I do,
we had a walk right, both pushing prams.
That's right. Wow, that's a long time ago.
A long time ago. But rather going back to that one, I'm going to pick up then in particular a very big question that's actually on one of your final slide. I'll simply ask it as, what would you mean by fundamental consciousness?
That's quite a big question, but
yeah, absolutely. A nice soundbite answer would be great, please.
Yeah. Fundamental consciousness is partly a way of explaining human consciousness, because I don't think that human consciousness can be traced entirely to the brain or can be seen as equivalent entirely to the brain. I think the brain's role is not so much to produce consciousness as to receive it. So if you postulate that there is this kind of fundamental consciousness in the world, which is universal, which is everywhere and in everything, and which maybe in a speculative way could actually give rise or engender matter itself as the essential quality in the universe, then then you can explain, well, it gives you a possible way of explaining human consciousness. Human consciousness is a kind of transmission of universal consciousness through the brain. The brain's role is to pick up this fundamental consciousness and channel it into our own individual being so that we become individual conscious. And I wrote a book called Spiritual Science, which is based on that principle, and it kind of explains how you can, it describes how you can come up with explanations for a range of different phenomena using that basic philosophical position.
Well, yeah, what excellent answer in a short space of time. Absolutely, yeah, no, thank you for that, I appreciate it. So I could ask more questions, but I'm going to open up again to see if anyone would like to ask a question. I see, well, put you on the spot, and yes, you put your camera on as you came on. They're not sure to ask a question, or if anyone else wants to take a moment to ask anything at this stage. Now's a good time to do it.
I popped something in the Q&A, but I'm not sure if you.
Oh, okay.
Just now, but I'm really curious because I have, with having the continuum aspect of it, how we and people tend to be in the middle. Does this mean that the people have both traits, and where does people who spiritual materialism, people who use the trappings of spirituality to further psychopathic or dark triad impulses, and so how do we navigate people who capture both?
Yeah,
really
good point. In the book, I actually say that there is a fourth area which is ideal for dark triad personalities, which is to be a spiritual teacher, because joking apart, many spiritual teachers are not genuinely spiritual at all. They are dark triad personalities who are extremely narcissistic and who are drawn to the arena of spirituality as a way of gathering followers, to give them admiration and to dominate followers. And sometimes it's harder to find an example of a good guru rather than a corrupt guru. There are a few, obviously there are some, but I often say, if you want to be a spiritual teacher, that's fine, but don't be a guru. And if you want to be a spiritual seeker, that's fine, but don't follow gurus, because obviously that's a bit of a very general statement. But it's true that the role of a spiritual teacher is hijacked by disconnected personalities. Unfortunately, they masquerade as enlightened people, but they are actually at the opposite end of the continuum. They are actually psychopathic or narcissistic. So it's a strange paradox. It happens with cult leaders too. There are many cult leaders who are extremely disordered people, disconnected people.
Thank you.
Absolutely beautiful answer. Just conscious, a little bit conscious of time. So if people do need to drop away, feel free. I'm happy to extend things a little longer if you've got a little more time, Steve.
Yeah, sure.
If there aren't any more questions, in the meantime, there's something. Well, the relationship there that you're describing, I absolutely love this continuum that you're describing, this continuum of the connection. It also, there's part of this that reminds me of Hartman's work around boundaries, almost looking at it the opposite way, the barriers that prevent those connections, so to speak. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's an important part of spirituality. You know, as we say, it could be the essence of spirituality. For people that are listening and wanting to move along that continuum, what would you say as perhaps some of those important steps or first steps a person could take to move further towards that more connected end of the spectrum?
Good question. As I mentioned in the presentation, spiritual paths are all spiritual paths of connection. So as long as you don't, have the misfortune of being led by a corrupt teacher, you can follow the path of Buddhism or Kabbalah or Sufism, whatever suits your interests or your personality. But I think meditation itself is a great way of cultivating connection. Some people find meditation difficult, at least in the beginning. I sometimes find it difficult. I've been meditating for 20 years. I sometimes still find it difficult sometimes. But there are lots of activities which I would class as active meditation too, like running. I love to go running. Running is a great way of quietening the mind and feeling connected to nature. Walking in the countryside is a very meditative activity. So there are lots of activities like that, swimming, which have a meditative quality. All those activities are very mindful, and therefore they have a mind quietening, connecting effect. But perhaps more than anything, acts of altruism, acts of service. Many spiritual traditions describe service or altruism as a spiritual practice, or at least as a quality to be cultivated. And that's very true. Acts of altruism or service, they help us to connect to other people. They help us to transcend separateness and selfishness. So they're really important too. At university, I teach a seminar on altruism. And I tell the students, I say, look, you've got a week now before the next session. Go away and make a conscious effort to be as altruistic as you can. Perform as many acts of altruism as you can this week and report back to me. So they do that, and they always report, they feel great when they come back. They talk about how empathic they felt towards other people, how they feel connected to other people. There's a new bond towards other people. So, altruism in itself is a spiritual practice, or, a path of connection.
Beautiful, beautiful. And perhaps that it also explains part of answer for Anya. Perhaps one of the ways we can differentiate a little is towards that selfless service. Certainly that's something that we've put into the master's course, is a whole module on service, in service to Gaia. So it's something right at the heart of what we believe is completely important in that arena. Stuttering a little there because I'm also looking for Matthew, if there's any more questions, and keeping an eye on that time.
I think, not seeing that's coming through now. So thank you for the question for Anya, and it's lovely to hear you voice it, Anya, actually, as well as seeing it there. But although I see Anya is putting something else in there, I think it's just more of a comment there. Is the form of meditation important? i.e. loving kindness versus breath focus, for example, which might point someone towards their own experience at the exclusion of empathy, or for the experience of others. Recent piece of research suggests this. So any thoughts in terms about different forms of meditation? Whilst they're all maybe towards connection, some maybe have different impacts than others.
So I missed that. What was that about exclusion of empathy? I missed that.
So I'll read it as Anya's written
Okay.
it.
Shall I explain?
Go on, yeah, you go for it, Anya. Use your own, yeah.
Oh, it was really funny because I was reading a study came up as I was doing my dissertation, which suggests that mindfulness is great, but if there's it can, depending on the kind of meditation you do, if it's very inward focused, it can actually people self-soothe away from relationship repair after rupture. Whereas perhaps loving kindness, which, you know, encourages more empathy, seems to be a countermeasure to that. And so I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, you know, actually the effect of the level of connection with ourselves and how that might, and the self-soothing might actually, ironically, make more fragile connections with others, or a desire to make reparations.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a risk of that. You know, I think you know, who is it that came up with the term spiritual materialism? It was Chogyam Rinpoche, I think, a Tibetan teacher, and he was talking about how narcissism can kind of infect spirituality, and even spiritual practices can encourage narcissism rather than help us to transcend it. So yeah, I mean, there's always that risk with meditation. So I guess it depends on a person's motivation. You can use any meditative or mindfulness practice to suit your own ends. You know, it can encourage, if your motive is narcissism, even only on a subconscious level, the practice could enhance that. So you got to make sure that you have a pure is the wrong word, but a positive motivation. But I agree. I think certain kinds of meditation are more likely to encourage selflessness, whereas other types of meditation are more likely to encourage narcissism, if that's a person's motivation.
And I guess, you know, it's not just about being the spiritual development, but also the psychological development. You've mentioned a few times the impact of trauma, and how that, and, you know, Stephen Porges talked about how, you know, trauma replaces patterns of connection with patterns of protection, which seems very much tying in with what you're talking about now.
So who was that talks about that?
Dr. Stephen Porges of polyvagal theory, which is thinking of very much of in this continuum, and how that applies to your continuum, and where we may find ourselves willingly or unwillingly along that strip.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, certainly trauma is a big factor in creating disconnection. Although interestingly, in my other research, I found that people who've undergone severe trauma can also sometimes shift into, undergo a sudden shift of identity, a sudden spiritual awakening. So when that the theory of post-traumatic growth is related to that as well. So in some ways, it seems like, the more intense a person's trauma is, the more potential they have for awakening if they can, acknowledge and accept their trauma, rather than being broken, or, rather than simply suffering through the trauma.
A cracking open for the next stage of development to begin, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, breaking open.
Steve, thank you ever so much for sharing this time together and bringing our week to end. It's as if you knew everything that was going on in the week, the way you tied up all those loose ends with this idea of continuum of connection. Thank you to all the people that have attended and made this week a really special week for, I think, all of us. And also thank you to all the people that have supported and helped put this into place, and particularly Matthew and the team at Bucks New University, who've been so supportive in making this happening. We really, we really hope this is the first of many.